My name is Elijah Freeman, and I was born on the 17th day of April, 1868, in Alexandria, Virginia. That makes me, let me see, 93 years old now, if my arithmetic's still any good. I'm sitting here today because there are stories that need telling before they're gone forever, and I might be the last person alive who heard them firsthand from the people who lived them. My grandfather on my father's side was named Moses Freeman. He was born in 1788 on a tobacco plantation in Maryland, about 30 miles north of what would become Washington. Lived to be 86 years old, died when I was 6, but I remember him clear as day-tall man with hands like tree roots, gnarled and strong, even in his old age. Those hands built part of the White House, the President's house, back when it was nothing but swamp and timber and dreams. My grandmother on my mother's side, Patience Caldwell. She was born in 1795 in Virginia. Smaller woman, quiet, but her fingers could work magic with a needle. She did stitching and curtain work in that same building, years later, when they were finishing the inside. Both of them gone now, of course. Been gone a long time. I grew up hearing these stories around the fire in the winter-time, or on the porch in summer, when the work was done. My grandfather would sit in his chair, had this old rocking chair made from oak, and he'd tell us about Georgetown in the 1790s, about the Irish architect who ran the work crews, about the sandstone they hauled from quarries down at Aquia Creek. He remembered the smell of the Potomac when the tide was low, remembered the sound of axes in the forest where they cleared land for what they called the President's Palace back then. Now my grandfather, he kept some of his tools from those days. Had a chisel, still got it actually dated 1795, carved into the handle. Had a marking gauge, too, but that got lost somewhere over the years. These weren't just tools to him, they were proof. Proof that his hands had shaped stone that still stands, even if nobody knows his name was ever attached to it. See, here's what most folks don't understand about how that building got built. When they talk about the White House, they mention the architects, the presidents, maybe the stonemasons from Scotland who did the fancy detail work. But the heavy labor, the real back-breaking work of hauling and cutting and lifting that was done by men who couldn't read or write, who didn't own their own bodies, who went home to plantations when the day's work was done. My grandfather was one of maybe 200 souls who built that house, and I want someone to know his story before I'm gone too. The way my grandfather told it, he was about 27 years old in the spring of 1795 when his owner, a Colonel William Thornton, came out to the tobacco fields one morning and told him to pack up. Said he was being hired out for construction work down in Georgetown on the new federal city they were building. My grandfather didn't have much say in the matter, none of them did, but he told me he felt something shift inside him that day, like maybe this was a chance to do something that would outlast tobacco rows and picking seasons. They assembled a group of 23 men from different plantations around Maryland and Northern Virginia, all hired out by their owners to work on the President's house. It was good money for the owners. You understand, they got paid for every day of labor their property provided, while the men themselves saw nothing but the same rations they always got. My grandfather traveled with 8 other men from Colonel Thornton's holdings, and they set out on a Friday morning in late April. I believe it was, though he was never quite sure of the exact date. The journey took 4 days through muddy roads that were barely more than wagon paths, and he said the further south they went, the more he could smell the marshland and the river. When they finally arrived at Georgetown, my grandfather said it was nothing but swamp and forest. Those were his exact words that stuck with me. There were some structures going up, yes, but mostly it was just cleared land and timber everywhere you looked, with the Potomac running brown and slow to the west. They set up in a temporary camp canvas tents, really. Nothing fancy, and that first night he lay there listening to the sounds of axes in the distance, and wood smoke drifting through the trees, and he knew his life had just changed in ways he couldn't quite name yet. The next morning they met the man who'd be running the construction, an Irishman named James Hoban. My grandfather described him as a stocky fellow with a heavy accent, fair-haired, maybe 40 years old or thereabouts, and he spoke to them direct and plain about what needed doing. Mr. Hoban had come from Charleston and had drawings, big sheets of paper with the building laid out in ink, and he showed them where the foundation would go, where the stone would come from. My grandfather said he seemed like a fair man, for the circumstances didn't waste words, didn't raise his voice unnecessarily, just expected the work to get done. In that first group, my grandfather met men he'd work alongside for the next 5 years. There was Benjamin Yarrow, a mason who already knew stonework from building plantation houses in Virginia, and Samuel Dixon, who worked as a blacksmith and kept their tools sharp and their iron fittings in order. These men became something like family in the years that followed, sharing the same labor, the same exhaustion, the same dream that maybe this thing they were building might mean something someday. My grandfather told me he knew, even that very first night, sleeping on hard ground with cedar smell in the air and mud from the Potomac on his boots, that this would change everything, though he couldn't have known then just how much or how little it would change for men like him. The work started in earnest that spring and carried on through the next 5 years of my grandfather's life. They worked from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week with Sunday as the only rest, and even then there was mending of tools and preparing for the week ahead. The stone they used came from quarries down at Aquia Creek in Virginia, about 40 miles south, and it arrived on boats up the Potomac, big blocks of sandstone, some of them weighing 400 pounds or more. My grandfather's job, along with most of the other men, was cutting those blocks to size, hauling them on wooden sledges, and setting them according to Mr. Hoban's specifications. They used simple tools, you understand, chisels, hammers, iron wedges for splitting, and wooden cranes with hemp rope for the heavy lifting. It was slow work, careful work, and it was brutal on the body. I remember my grandfather describing the summers of 1796 and 1797 as some of the hottest he'd ever known, with the sun beating down on that open construction site, and no shade to speak of except what little the unfinished walls provided. The men would drink water from barrels that got warm by midday, and the stone would get so hot you couldn't touch it with bare hands for long. Then came the winter of 1798, and that was just as bad, in the opposite direction, freezing winds off the Potomac, fingers going numb, trying to work stone that was cold enough to crack wrong if you hit it at the wrong angle. But the work continued, because it had to. There was a hierarchy on that site, white supervisors at the top, then skilled craftsmen both free and enslaved. then the laborers at the bottom doing the heavy hauling and basic stone work. My grandfather fell somewhere in the middle, skilled enough with his hands that they trusted him to cut stone, but still a man who didn't own himself. President Washington himself came to visit the construction in July of 1796. My grandfather saw him from a distance, tall man on a horse, talking with Mr. Hoban about the progress. He told me he remembers thinking how strange it was, building a house for a man who lived in freedom, while he himself would go back to a plantation when the job was done. But he didn't dwell on that, not while he was working. You couldn't afford to let your mind wander when you were handling 400-pound blocks of stone. The accident happened in the summer of 1798, middle of July as I recall him telling it, on a day so hot the air felt thick as cotton. They were working on the second level, setting stone on wooden scaffolding that ran along the south wall, and something went wrong with the support beams. Either they were overloaded or the wood had a weakness nobody saw. My grandfather was never quite sure which. All he knew was that he heard a crack like a rifle shot, and then the whole section of scaffold started coming down. 7 men were up there when it collapsed, including Samuel Dixon, the blacksmith I mentioned earlier. My grandfather was on the ground loading a sledge when it happened, so he saw the whole thing, the dust rising up in a cloud, timber crashing down, men falling, and then the screaming started. When the dust settled enough to see, they found Samuel pinned under one of the main support beams, a piece of timber maybe a foot thick and 12 feet long. His left hand was crushed beneath it, blood mixing with the limestone dust and making a kind of paste on the ground. The other men had gotten clear or were just shaken up, but Samuel was stuck and he was screaming, and my grandfather said it was a sound he never forgot, high and terrible and full of fear. Benjamin Euro was already there trying to lift the beam, but it was too heavy for one man. My grandfather dropped what he was doing and ran over to help, and that's when the white supervisor, a man whose name my grandfather never told me or maybe never knew, came over and told them to leave him. Said they were losing work time, said they'd get to Samuel when they could spare the men, said to get back to their tasks. Now, my grandfather had never disobeyed a direct order in his life, not once, because he knew what that could cost a man who looked like him. But he told me that standing there, hearing Samuel scream, and seeing that blood spreading out in the dust, something just broke loose inside him. He picked up an iron lever they used for prying stone, walked back over to where Samuel was trapped, wedged that lever under the beam, and started pushing down with everything he had. Benjamin saw what he was doing and grabbed hold too, and then 3 more men joined in without being asked, and together they lifted that beam just enough for 2 others to drag Samuel out from under it. The whole thing took maybe 2 minutes, maybe less, but my grandfather said it felt like an hour, every second expecting to hear that supervisor's voice ordering them to stop, or maybe worse. Samuel lived, but he lost the use of his left hand. The bones had been crushed too badly to ever heal right. As for my grandfather, he got 15 lashes for disobeying orders and was transferred to the quarry work down at Aquia Creek, which was harder labor and meant being away from the main construction site. But here's the strange thing, the part that showed him there were layers to how people saw each other even in a system that was fundamentally broken. Mr. Hoban never spoke to him directly after that incident, never acknowledged what he'd done. But my grandfather said he'd noticed that his rations at the quarry were always a little larger than what the other men got. And sometimes there'd be an extra piece of salt pork or an extra measure of cornmeal. And when they'd cross paths on those occasions when my grandfather came back to the main site to deliver stone, Mr. Hoban would give him just the smallest nod, nothing more. Nothing that anyone else would notice, but my grandfather saw it. He understood it was the only recognition that could exist between them in that time and place, a silent acknowledgment that what he'd done had been seen and maybe, in some way, he couldn't express outright, respected. My grandmother on my mother's side, Patience Caldwell, she came into the story later, during the finishing work in 1799 and 1800. While my grandfather was down at the quarries cutting stone, Patience was brought in from a plantation in Virginia to do sewing and upholstery work for the interior rooms. She was skilled with fine needlework, the kind of detailed stitching that white ladies would pay good money for, and they needed curtains made, cushions covered, that sort of finish work that turned a building into a residence. She told me once, years later, when I was a boy, that she'd embroidered a pattern of stars into a curtain for one of the second-floor rooms. I think she said it was 13 stars for the original states, and she wondered sometimes if that curtain was still hanging there, if anyone ever noticed those stars, if anyone knew that a woman named Patience Caldwell had put them there with her own hands, stitch by stitch. My grandfather met my grandmother Ruth during those construction years. She was working as a cook, preparing meals for the labor crews, and she never once set foot inside the main building. Wasn't allowed to, even though she was feeding the men who built it. They married in 1797, I believe it was, in whatever kind of ceremony enslaved people could manage back then. Nothing legal or binding in the eyes of the law, but real enough to them. Ruth lived until I was born. Actually, she died when I was about 3 years old, so I have just the faintest memory of her, mostly the sound of her voice humming hymns in the kitchen. There were other families involved, too, names my grandfather would mention when he told these stories. The Jennings family, the Bells, the Montgomerys men, and women both, some doing skilled work, most doing hard labor, all of them part of building, something they'd never truly be part of. My grandfather estimated that maybe 200 souls in total worked on that construction over the years it took to complete, though I couldn't tell you if that number's exact or just his best guess from memory. What I do know is that none of their names appear in any official record of the building. When they write the history books, when they give tours of the White House, they talk about James Hoban, the architect. They talk about the Scottish stonemasons who did the decorative work. They mention President Washington's involvement in the planning, but they don't talk about Moses Freeman or Benjamin, Yarrow or Samuel Dixon or Patience Caldwell or any of the others. The saddest part of my grandfather's story, the part that seemed to weigh on him most in his old age, was what happened when the work was finally done. In November of 1800, President John Adams moved into the residence, even though it wasn't completely finished, still had plasterers working, still had painters doing trim, but it was habitable enough for the president and his wife. And once the family moved in, they started dismissing the workers, just sending them back to wherever they'd come from with no ceremony, no acknowledgement, nothing. My grandfather returned to Colonel Thornton's plantation in Maryland and went right back to working tobacco fields, as if those 5 years building the president's house had been nothing more than a brief interruption. He told me once, and his voice got quiet when he said this, "I built the house where freedom lived, then went back to change." That's the phrase he used, and it stuck with me all these years because of the pure irony in it. The way history can twist things into shapes that don't make any sense when you really look at them. My grandfather worked on that plantation until 1822, when Colonel Thornton died and his will freed several of his slaves, my grandfather among them. Moses was 54 years old by then, more than half his life spent in bondage, and he moved to Baltimore and worked as a free carpenter for the next 32 years until his health gave out. He did good work, built houses and furniture, made an honest living, but he always kept one small piece of stone from the White House construction, just a fragment of sandstone, about the size of a man's fist, that he'd chipped off and carried with him when he left Georgetown. He kept it on a shelf in every house he ever lived in, and I saw it myself in the winter of 1881, when I was 13 years old, and visiting him in Baltimore, not long before he passed. That stone was smooth on one side where it had been cut, rough on the other where it had been broken, and my grandfather would hold it sometimes and just turn it over in those gnarled hands, not saying anything, just remembering. He told his stories to his children and his grandchildren on winter nights when the work was done, sitting by the fire or the stove, and we'd listen to him talk about Georgetown and the Potomac and James Hoban and all those men whose names nobody remembers now. There was pride in his voice when he talked about the work itself, about getting the stones level and true, about the satisfaction of building something that would outlast him by centuries. But there was bitterness, too, and it was the kind of bitterness that comes from knowing you did something important and knowing that history won't remember you did it. He built something that would last centuries, but nobody would ever know his name was part of it. That contradiction lived in him until the day he died. And I think it lives in me, too, knowing his story and wondering if anyone will care that I'm telling it now. I'm 93 years old now, sitting here in 1961, and I've seen 18 presidents come and go since the day I was born. I've watched that building, the one my grandfather helped raise from Swampland, become something like a symbol for the whole country. Seen it on television now and then when they show news from Washington, and every time I see those white walls on that little screen I think about Moses Freeman and his calloused hands and that piece of sandstone he kept on his shelf. I think about Patience Caldwell and her embroidered stars, about Benjamin Yarrow and Samuel Dixon and Ruth and all those others whose names I heard around the fire when I was young. Most people my age don't remember much from when they were children, but those stories, those stuck with me, got burned into my memory somehow, and I suppose that's why I'm telling them now. I only visited Washington, D.C. once in my whole life, back in 1953, when I was 85 years old. My daughter drove me down there, said I should see it at least once before I got too old to travel, and we went on a warm day in October when the leaves were turning. We drove down Pennsylvania Avenue, and I saw the White House from the street, those white walls just like I'd imagined them from my grandfather's descriptions, and I asked my daughter to stop the car. I got out and walked up to the fence, stood there looking through the iron bars at that building, and I didn't go inside. Didn't even try to. I just stood there on the sidewalk thinking about my grandfather Moses, about all those men who'd hauled stone and mixed mortar and worked themselves near to death in the heat and the cold, and I felt this strange mixture of pride and anger and sadness all at once. Pride because the work was beautiful. You could see that even from the street. Anger because there's no plaque, no memorial, nothing that says their names or acknowledges what they did. And sadness because I knew then, standing there at 85 years old, that there probably never would be. I don't know what happened to most of the families my grandfather talked about, the Jennings, the Bells, the Montgomerys. Don't know where they ended up, where they're buried, if their descendants even know their ancestors built that house. That history just got scattered to the wind like so much dust. But I still have my grandfather's chisel, the one from 1795 with the date carved right into the handle. It sits on my shelf now, same way that piece of sandstone sat on his, and when I hold it I can almost feel the weight of all those years, all that work, all those unnamed hands that shaped something permanent. History remembers the architects and the presidents, and maybe that's how it has to be. I'm not fool enough to think the world's going to change just because I tell this story. But buildings don't raise themselves. Somebody has to cut the stone, has to haul it, has to set it in place, and those somebodies were people with names and lives and families, even if the law said they weren't quite people, even if the records don't show they were ever there. My grandfather built something that's still standing 161 years later, and that chisel is the only proof I have that his hands were part of it. I wanted someone to know that, write it down somewhere, before it's too late and I'm gone too, and there's nobody left who remembers hearing these stories firsthand. That's why I'm sitting here today, talking to you, making sure Moses Freeman's name gets said out loud at least one more time before the silence takes it forever.